Hello, my name is Harlan Ferguson, and this is my final project for the open source class, written all in Python. My student number is just right here, 1011333838. And this is my project. So what I've done is I got special permission via email with Michael just to do a work order management system. It kind of looked with like a similar kind of requirement to the library system that was proposed in the documentation. So I figured that going down this avenue, I'd be able to kind of hit all the marks on the rubric, which I'll pull up at the end and see if everything makes sense. So the way that I approached this originally was to do it as a console app using object-oriented programming. And then about a quarter of the way through, I decided that I was going to do a graphical user interface, which I'll be calling GUIs the whole time, because that's how they should be pronounced. So I ended up doing a GUI program using tkinter, the Python library, and then using an MVC style of design for controlling how the program talks to itself, and then using object-oriented programming throughout. So I have a model here which just has a database file in it, or sorry, not a database file, a Python file with a database class. I used to have other classes in there too, and everything fully worked on the console, and then I decided to pretty much just rewrite it from scratch and work it with a GUI and a database. So diving right in here, just like we did in lab, I use SQLite 3. I make a class, and then what I do is I make a connection to workorders.db, and then I hard-coded this so that if you're running this for the first time, it'll just make it on your computer here. And then I call a function createTable. So the createTable, again, similar to what we did in class, is we do a createTable if not exists. So for testing, I could keep on running the program and I wouldn't run into issues with the table already existing. And then another thing as well is through research I found that for there's like a certain shortcut where you don't have to make a cursor every time. So in some of the methods I just execute directly from the connection, but in others I will make a cursor, and I'll get into that in a second. I also generated an ID with an auto increment, just so that every single entry would be unique. And then I just have some pretty basic SQL methods here. So something to just add a new work order. So just a very simple insert. We have two different searches, one by unit number and one by member name, which I'll touch on later on. Then we have an update or an edit, a way to delete by ID. And sorry, the update is used, you pass an ID, and that's how it updates. And then just a few different display. So since we're doing selects, we don't have to do the commit. But what I did do here was I used a fetch all, which is a method of the cursor class. So I did have to kind of make a cursor for these ones. But we're going to be returning rows and then using that list of tuples, and we will be using that later on. So that's the database. Pretty straightforward SQL. So the model is pretty simplistic in this program. What's not simplistic, what I spent, I would say 90% of the time on, was the view. Whew. Oh, the view. So there's the main class, which is the GUI. So that's where all the frames get instantiated in. So in tkinter, however you pronounce it, I'm sure that's not the, whatever, it doesn't matter. You have your main window, which is what I set here, and then that window has a thing called a frame, which is like a different view. And so with tkinter, you can have it so that if you click a button, it'll just open a new window and you have different functionality there. But I wanted it to all stay within the same window. And in order to do that, you have to make different frames. And then you pack or unpack whichever frame you want. So the GUI instantiates all of these frames. Pass it the controller, which we'll see later. And then with these different shows, in order to make it work, you have to first clear the frame from the window or from the view. And since we have 4 different ones, you kind of want to be safe and just clear all 3 depending on where you are in the program. And then once you've ensured that the window is clear, then you can pack a frame. So those are pretty simplistic. These ones are a little bit different just because the way I went about positioning, I went with more of like a grid style, which, sorry, I'll go into this in more detail later. But I needed this to make a list box resize a bit better. Because I found that you could code it all and like following guides and doing research, but no matter what, like getting the positioning of everything was not simple. So what I'll actually do here is I'll start from the main menu frame. So this is also a pretty simple frame as well. It just consists of 3 different buttons. And in tkinter, a button will have a command. So when a user clicks on the button, it can use or it can call a function. So here it's calling master show work order. So since we're inheriting master, in this case, is GUI. So we have all these functions here. So in the main menu, we're just pretty much saying like GUI.showWorkOrderFrame, show work order list frame, and then quitting. So I'm going to quickly just run the first screen here just so we can see this. It's not beautiful, but it is functional. So we like function. So this is just the main menu. It's 3 buttons: add a work order, view, work orders, and exit. So I'm going to get into these later. Straightforward. So if we go into add, if we press that first button and go into add a work order, I first set it up to be a very basic form. So it just had labels and text boxes. And then after I got everything working in the basic form, I kind of wanted to complicate it for no reason. So I had it set up. So now it is set up so that it takes, the first field is entering the date. So I found this library called TK Calendar, which instead of having a little input box, it's a little calendar. And then when you click on the date, then it just properly inserts everything. The date entry returns a date time object though, which means in order for it to nicely work with my SQL database, I do have to convert it to a string, which I do later and I'll show later. But we take the date as a date time to start. Then we take the member name, we take the unit number. For simplicity, it's all strings. Then for this part here, this is when I use, it's pretty much my only use of a list and /or dictionary, which is one of the number 6 on the requirement. And I decided to go with this route because I wanted to avoid spelling mistakes and I wanted to avoid redundancy or too many issues existing. So I wanted just a drop-down menu, where just instead of someone just typing what the problem was, they can just select from the drop-down. And so this is where I ended up using a list. Then we have the comments. So instead of an entry for the comments, I use a text, which just gives me a bit more room to work with. It's easier to kind of put a paragraph in, whereas I found when it was first set up with an entry, you couldn't really see what you wrote. And then we have a submit button, which calls the submit work order method over here, and then a back button, which just calls the show main, which we've seen before. This took a little bit of time, and it's still not perfect, but it's pretty much just positioning all of the widgets in a place. And then we have a submit work order button. So first we have to get the data from the fields. So we get the date, which, as I said above or earlier, it returns a date time object. So then I convert it to a string so that it goes into the database nicely. And then we just get all the other fields. And then this one's just a little bit different again because we used a text instead of entry. And from my understanding with the text, this is just kind of like a range. So it's like from the first line to the end of everything. So that's just why that's a little bit different. And then we insert it into the database using a method we already saw from the model database. So that's just straight up insert, just like that. And then initially I had it so that it then just returned to the main menu, but instead I decided to just blank all of the entries and the inputs, because at work sometimes I've had to take in multiple requests at once. So it kind of just made more sense to be able to do that all in one run. So now I'm just going to quickly show the add work order after talking about it. So this is it here. So it automatically goes to today's date, but you can choose whichever kind of date you want. But let's just go with today's date. And we can put in a member. So let's just go with Robert. We'll put him in unit 510. And then we can select what kind of issue Robert's having. So let's just go with, oh, sorry, it's been a long day. Let's go with drywall. And then let's say water leak from last year has ceiling damage. Please fix it ASAP. So the comment box is just I just put the comment box there so you can elaborate on what the issue is. And it's in a pretty basic state, but from here you can just add, as a maintenance worker, you can then add notes from here if you wanted to, and then just put in a date. So like that's like an example of how maintenance can use it. So we'll submit that, and then after I submitted it, it clears everything, so I can continue to make work orders if I want. Now there's a view work order button, which is going to show us all, but we're not there yet. So this is going to be a long video. I apologize in advance. So now we have a frame that displays work orders. So same kind of setup as the other frames. We do some inheritance. We pass and set a controller. And then we're going to be creating widgets and loading work orders. The widgets this time consists of a list box and a bunch of buttons. And what the list box allows me to do is to print out specific rows from the database, and then the user can click on that row to highlight it, and then they can click on one of the buttons, which would then call a method on that selected row. So we have an edit and delete button, for example. So of the list, we can be very specific on what we want to do with it. That took a lot of time, but I think it's worth it because it just really makes the user experience a lot easier. So we have a load work orders. So this I plan to do early on, and then kind of after I finish everything. Like, I already think of better ways I could have done the graphical user interface, the GUI, but we are where we're at. The load work orders function lists the last 5 made work orders. And so that's what first gets displayed on this frame. And my thinking behind it was, say you created a bunch of work orders on Monday, and then you worked throughout the week, and then you came back to the program on Thursday, but you kind of forgot what your like priority or kind of the scope of everything you're working on. This will just remind you that the last 5 things you entered were this, 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 and this. You'd be like, oh yeah, I forgot to look at that. I'm just going to quickly show it because I'm just explaining when I could just show it. So when you first open the view work orders, it shows the last 5 we made. So the one we just made with Robert and his drywall is right there at the top. And I just wanted it to be a quick glance thing. So it gives us an ID of the work order. It gives us the name of the person who requested it. And then it just gives the issue. But we don't really dive into anything deeper than that. And that was just like a first glance. I forget what I'm kind of looking at. On Monday, I worked on Casey's. Today is Friday. Oh, I still have Amanda and Robert's to do. So that was kind of my idea behind that. And then we've got the view work orders. So this just shows all of them, which is nice. And then I have, I'm not gonna, I guess I have to get into it, sorry. So it clears the list box. So if you don't do this, it kind of just adds onto each other. So I clear the list box, and then I call a function from the database just to get all of the work orders. And then before I display those, I put in just the titles, like so. It's not the best way to do it, but it was kind of just like a quick fix sort of situation. And then I just do a for loop because the get all work orders returns, I believe it returns a tuple or a dictionary. But this just allows you to print it all. And then display the search work orders. So when you search something, more buttons and columns pop up. So this is just called when you click the search button, and then more stuff pops up, and then the new button that pops up, this new search button that pops up is what actually searches the work orders. So if I wanted to search, I clicked that search button, and then this extra stuff popped up. So I'm aware formatting isn't great, but I'm done with it. So you can search by member or by unit. So I did that because sometimes you'll forget. It's usually best to search by unit, but sometimes you'll forget the unit number, so you can also search by member. But unit's best because there's only one unit number in the building, so it's kind of like its own unique ID. So you can search by unit, and we can see here we have 2 different work orders, one from me, one from Amanda, and we've got appliance issue where the fridge is running, someone needs to catch it, and then stairway handle is too loose. So we've got a working search function here, and all of this is resizable, which is nice. And that just works by we display those new buttons, and then once they're displayed, we make sure that they're not empty. So if member isn't empty, that means someone put in the member name. So then we look at the method from the database and just search the work order by member name, and we just print it like above with a for loop. Exact same thing, but for unit number. And then if you went in, and this is some kind of error handling, where if you go in and you search for nothing, it reminds you to search for something. So that's cool. Then we have an edit work order. So this is when things got really spicy, and this is where I lost most of my brain cells. So we use a method of the listbox class, which when you click and it highlights blue, it just gets you that selection. And so you store it to selected. So if nothing's selected, it'll tell you, like, select something. Come on. Exceptions. And then we store the work order ID. So we grab it. I apologize. Shh. Sorry, it's a bit of a basket case. So we grab the ID, and then, sorry about that, I had to pause the video and tell my dog to relax. So we get the ID from the cursor selection, and then we pass that ID to a new frame within a frame. So it's like, it gets kind of layered. But we then pass that to a new frame, and then from that new frame, we can edit what we selected. I'll show that in a second. And then delete work order. Luckily, this was pretty straightforward. So it's the same kind of thing. You get the cursor selection, and then you just call a function that I already have. Okay, so I did some research and found this ask yes no, which just returns a Boolean. So then you say, are you sure that you want to delete this? And then if they say yes, then you call the delete work order method from the database class, and you pass it that work order ID that you took from the cursor selection, and then you just also delete the line in the list box. The edit work order frame, so this is what just got called, or what got passed. So we show this, and then this has a work order ID. So the one that you select and highlights blue, then gets that work order ID, gets passed to this. And then it's a pretty similar setup to when you're adding a work order for the first time. The difference being that we then have to kind of load in that information beforehand. So we make the boxes, but we don't leave them empty. We make them and then put stuff in them. And so we do a load work order, which is just getting a work order by ID, and then just populating the fields with that item. And then when we update the work orders, you click a button to make an edit. Similar like we've seen before, we get everything from the fields after they've been changed or not changed. Call an update work order function that we saw in the database class, and then we return to the main menu. So showing that, so say we want to edit this poor joke. So now we can see that we've updated that comment there. Finally, what we have is a delete. So once I select something from the list box, click the delete. Are you sure you want to delete it? Yes. And then it's gone. Cannot be found again. So I believe that's everything. So I showed, oh no, I didn't show the control, I don't think. If I did show this already, I apologize. We're 24 minutes in, and I am very tired. So I'll just go over this again quickly. So I have a controller. The controller is passed a database. and then it instantiates a GUI, and it creates a table, and then it has a method called run, which uses a method of tkinter, which just runs the graphical user interface. And then in the main method, do all our imports. We make our database. We make our controller and pass our database to the controller, and then we just call that run function. I also have a README that I made, specifically because I used an external library that requires a pip install. So I have a requirements.txt, and that's for this TK calendar, that just special input field. So that's just there on my GitHub. So it's easier for new users to download it. I'm going to stop talking now because I feel like I am losing control. But thank you for watching, and thank you for, oh, I guess I should go over this quickly. Never mind, I'm not done yet. So looking over the rubric, so I do have a functioning menu. I do have way more than 3 functions, so that's cool. Now, I read either in an email or a message that Michael sent out, but correct me if I'm wrong. I'm pretty sure that message said you don't have to worry about line number 3 here if you do use a database. So I don't save any files because I'm using SQLite 3. So I have the project handling adequate exceptions. So if you're calling a function but you're not actually passing it anything to the function, it does do a pop-up and custom pop-ups in the GUI. So I believe I have handled exceptions pretty well. I also believe that the format is fair. Definitely could look a tiny bit better, but I think given that doing a GUI is only worth 5 points, I think, you know, it looks pretty good. I only ended up using 1 list, but again, I think that's okay since I'm not using it as a data type. I'm just using SQL. Project naming conventions. I tried to name everything as precise as possible. Like, I know I kind of made a lot of frames, but tried to make it obvious as to what the frame was displaying and what the method was doing within each file. I used object-oriented programming throughout, as well as inheritance. Used a database, and then used a GUI. So hopefully I hit everything spot on, and if not, I think that's a bonus point. So if I lost something there, bonus, that's great. Okie dokie. Now I'm done. Thank you so much for watching and listening, and take care.